My name is Dr. Elena Marsh. I'm 58 years old, and for the last 16 years, I've been carrying a secret that has cost me my career, my reputation, and very nearly my sanity. I was a marine biologist with the Deep Sea Research Institute, stationed out of their facility in San Diego. I had published papers on bioluminescent organisms, held a position most researchers would consider a dream job, and spent more time below 1,000 feet than most people spend on airplanes. On October 17, 2009, at exactly 11:43 inches the morning, the external camera on our research submersible captured something at 2,400 feet below the surface of the Western Pacific that should not exist. I've kept the footage hidden all these years because the moment I reported what we saw, armed military personnel confiscated our vessel, threatened my crew, and made it very clear that speaking about our discovery would be considered a breach of national security. But 3 months ago, something changed. Deep-sea drilling operations near the original site were suddenly halted with no public explanation. Seismologists have begun detecting unusual acoustic patterns in the trench, rhythmic and regular, that one leaked report described as potentially non-geological in origin. I believe we're running out of time to ignore what's down there. What we captured wasn't just an unknown species. It was a creature that looked disturbingly human from the waist up, with translucent skin and eyes adapted for absolute darkness. And it was writing, not making marks or scratches like an animal might. Writing actual symbols with deliberate, intelligent purpose on the rock face near a hydrothermal vent. When those symbols were finally translated, the message was something that still keeps me awake at night. I need to tell this story exactly as it happened, because I believe the warning we found is real, and because staying silent has begun to feel more dangerous than speaking. This is everything I remember, documented as carefully as I can, about the 6 days that changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in the deepest parts of our ocean. The autumn of 2009 had been unseasonably warm in San Diego, but by late September I was already preparing for our deployment to the Western Pacific. I was 42 years old then, had been with the Deep Sea Research Institute for 11 years, and this was going to be my 7th expedition as lead research scientist. The mission parameters were straightforward. Document bioluminescent species in the trench system west of the Mariana Islands, collect water samples at various depths, and deploy 3 automated sensor arrays that would monitor deep ocean currents for the next 18 months. Standard work for our team. Nothing about the assignment suggested it would be anything other than routine. Our submersible was the Nereus 3, a titanium-hulled research vessel capable of reaching depths just over 3,000 feet. She wasn't the newest model in the Institute's fleet, but she was reliable. I'd logged maybe 200 hours in her over the previous 3 years. The vessel carried a crew of 3, myself as lead scientist and primary pilot, Dr. James Chen as co-pilot and equipment specialist, and Robert Delacroix as our systems engineer and documentation officer. We'd worked together on 4 previous expeditions. James was methodical and cautious, former Navy who'd transitioned to marine research after his service ended. Robert was younger, only 28 at the time, but brilliant with the camera systems and data management. We trusted each other completely in an environment where trust was the difference between life and death. We shipped out of Guam on October 3rd aboard the research vessel Atlantica, a 140-foot support ship that would serve as our surface base. The journey to our dive site took 3 days. I spent most of that time reviewing our target coordinates, studying maps of the trench topography, and running through equipment checks with James and Robert. The plan called for 8 dives over 12 days, each dive lasting between 6 and 8 hours depending on battery reserves and what we encountered. Our target depth range was between 2,200 and 2,800 feet, deep enough to find interesting organisms, but shallow enough that the Nereus 3 could handle it comfortably within her safety margins. The first 5 dives went exactly according to plan. We documented 17 species of bioluminescent fish, including what we believed might be an undocumented variant of hatchetfish. We collected our water samples, deployed 2 of the 3 sensor arrays, and filled our data drives with footage of the kind of alien landscape that most people never get to see. Hydrothermal vents pumping superheated water into the freezing darkness, bacterial mats glowing faintly in colors that seemed to shift as we passed, and the constant slow drift of marine snow falling through the water column like an underwater blizzard. I'd seen similar environments dozens of times before, but there was always something humbling about being in a place so removed from sunlight and surface life. On the evening of October 16th, we were planning our sixth dive for the following morning. The target was a section of the trench wall where sonar had detected what appeared to be an unusual geological formation, possibly a collapsed lava tube or cave system. James thought it might harbor congregations of deep-sea species seeking shelter from currents. Robert wanted to get footage of the rock formations themselves, which showed up on sonar as unusually regular, almost geometric in places. I approved the dive site and we set our descent time for 8:30 a.m., calculating we'd reach target depth around 9:15 and have approximately 6 hours of exploration time before needing to begin our ascent. I remember eating dinner that night in the Atlantica's galley with James and Robert. We were talking about what we might find, speculating about the cave system, debating whether the geometric shapes on sonar were just artifacts of how sound waves reflected off angled rock faces. Robert joked that maybe we'd find Atlantis down there. James told him to be careful what he wished for. I went to my cabin around 10 p.m., reviewed my notes one more time, and fell asleep thinking about bioluminescent bacteria and water chemistry. I had no sense that the next day would be the last normal dive I'd ever make. No warning that in less than 14 hours, everything I understood about marine biology was going to be turned completely inside out. We were approximately 30 feet inside the cave when Robert said something I'll never forget. "Elena, I've got movement on camera 4. Camera 4 was one of our flank cameras, angled to show the area behind and to our right. I glanced at the monitor displaying its feed. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the cave wall and the darkness beyond our lights. Then something moved at the edge of our light radius, too far out to see clearly but definitely there. Could be a fish, James said, but his voice had an uncertainty in it. We'd all seen countless fish in these environments, and you developed an instinct for how they moved. This wasn't moving like a fish. The motion was too deliberate, too controlled. Whatever it was seemed to be pacing us, staying just at the limit of our visibility. I slowed the Nereus III and rotated us slightly to bring more light toward the movement. That's when we got our first clear look at it, and I felt my hands tighten on the controls. The figure was roughly 6 feet long from what I could estimate, oriented horizontally in the water the way a swimming creature would be. The body plan was wrong though. The lower half had what looked like a tail or fused legs that moved with an undulating motion, powerful strokes that propelled it through the water with minimal effort. But the upper half, from approximately the waist up, was humanoid. 2 arms, clearly defined shoulders, and a head with features I could make out even at that distance. "Jesus Christ," Robert whispered. James said nothing, but I heard his breathing change over the intercom, faster and shallower. I kept the submersible steady, not moving forward or back, just holding position while we all stared at the monitor. The creature maintained its distance for maybe 20 seconds. Then, with a movement that seemed almost curious, it swam closer. Not rapidly, not aggressively, just a steady approach that brought it fully into our light field. I could see it clearly now, on 3 different camera feeds. The skin was pale, almost translucent, with a faint pattern of what might have been chromatophores like you'd see on a squid or octopus. The face was streamlined but recognizably face-like, with a nose, a mouth, and eyes that were disproportionately large and completely black. No visible whites, just dark orbs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The hands had elongated fingers, and I could see webbing between them. The hair, if that's what it was, floated around the head in long strands that moved independent of the water current. It stopped approximately 12 feet from our forward viewport and hung there in the water, making small adjustments with its tail to maintain position. And then it turned its head, a precise, deliberate movement, and looked directly at camera 2. Not at our lights. "Did that just happen?" Robert's voice was shaky. James was checking and rechecking the camera files, making sure everything had recorded properly. I tried to process what I'd seen, running through every species of marine life I'd ever studied or read about, trying to find something that matched. Nothing did. Seals were humanoid in some ways, but not like this. No seal had a face like that or hands with individual fingers. No known fish had that body structure. I'd just seen something that, according to everything I'd learned in 20 years of marine biology, should not exist. "We need to surface," James said. "We need to report this immediately." But before I could respond, before I could even begin to turn the Nereus 3 around, Robert spoke again. His voice was barely above a whisper. "It's coming back, and it's not alone." There were 3 of them now. The original creature had returned, and it had brought 2 others with it. They emerged from the darkness beyond our lights, like ghosts, materializing out of nothing, swimming in a loose formation that suggested coordination, maybe even communication. All 3 had the same basic body structure, the humanoid upper half transitioning to that powerful tail, but there were differences. One was slightly smaller than the others, maybe 5.5 feet long. Another had darker pigmentation, almost gray compared to the translucent pale of the first. They kept their distance, approximately 20 feet from the submersible, and I had the distinct impression they were assessing us, trying to determine if we posed a threat. James had his hand on the ballast control, ready to begin our ascent if they showed any sign of aggression. Robert had every camera recording and was frantically adjusting angles to keep all 3 creatures in frame. I kept the Nereus III motionless, not wanting to make any sudden movements that might provoke a response. My training said to observe and document, to remain calm and professional, but my hands were shaking slightly on the controls, and my heart was beating hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. The creatures seemed to reach some kind of consensus. The 2 newcomers stayed back while the original one, the first we'd seen, swam closer again. It approached the rock wall to our left, the cave wall we'd been surveying before all this began. It moved along the wall slowly, running its hands over the surface as if searching for something specific. Then it stopped at a section of rock that looked smoother than the surrounding area, a relatively flat face, maybe 4 feet across. The creature reached down to the cave floor, or what passed for a floor in this environment, and picked up something small. I asked Robert to zoom camera 3, which had the best angle on what was happening. The object in the creature's hand was a piece of rock, maybe 3 inches long and tapered to a point. It looked like volcanic glass, obsidian or something similar, the kind of sharp fragment you might find near old lava flows. The creature examined it briefly, then turned back to the smooth section of wall and began to make marks on the stone surface. Deliberate, controlled marks. It was using the sharp rock as a tool, carving into the softer stone beneath. Then the creature that had been carving turned and looked directly at our submersible. Not at the cameras this time, but at the viewport where it couldn't possibly see us through the thick acrylic but seemed to know we were there anyway. It held its position for several seconds, its large black eyes fixed on our location. I had the uncomfortable feeling that it was trying to communicate something, that the symbols on the wall weren't random but were meant to convey a message. Whether that message was intended for us or for others of its kind, I couldn't tell. The creature made a sound, a long modulated tone that Robert later described as almost musical. The other 2 responded with similar vocalizations, and then all 3 of them turned simultaneously and swam away from the cave wall. They didn't flee or dart away in panic. They simply left, their tails moving in synchronized strokes, their bodies fading into the darkness beyond our lights until we couldn't see them anymore. The entire encounter, from when the first creature had appeared to when all 3 vanished, had lasted 42 minutes. We sat in silence for maybe 30 seconds. The cave around us was empty again, just rock and water and the faint drift of particles in our light beams. Then Robert spoke, his voice hoarse. "Please tell me we got all of that. Please tell me every camera was recording." James checked the system logs. All 6 cameras had been recording continuously. We had the footage. We had 42 minutes of documented evidence of something that would change everything we thought we understood about evolution, intelligence, and what lived in the deepest parts of our ocean. I made the decision then that probably saved our lives, or at least our ability to retain any evidence of what we'd seen. I told Robert to copy all the footage from the past hour to our backup drives immediately, before we even began our ascent. Standard protocol was to copy data at the end of each dive, back on the Atlantica where we had better equipment and more storage. But something told me we needed redundancy now, needed the footage secured on multiple devices before we surfaced and reported what we'd found. Robert worked quickly, copying files to 3 separate encrypted drives, while James and I began our ascent procedure. We rose slowly through the water column, following our decompression schedule, neither of us speaking much. I kept thinking about the symbols on the cave wall, wondering if they were still there, or if the creatures would return and erase them. Wondering what they said and why a species living at 2,400 feet, in perpetual darkness and crushing pressure, would need or want a written language. We broke the surface at 1:47 p.m. The Atlantica's crew secured our submersible and opened the hatch, and I climbed out into the bright sunlight feeling like I'd just returned from another planet. James and Robert followed, both of them clutching equipment bags that contained our backup drives. We'd agreed without discussing it that the drives would stay with us personally until we understood what we were dealing with. Captain Morrison met us on deck, asking how the dive had gone. I told him we needed to speak with him privately, immediately, in his quarters. Something in my expression must have conveyed the seriousness, because he didn't ask questions, just nodded and led us inside. What I didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that we had less than 48 hours before everything would be taken from us. Captain Morrison's quarters on the Atlantica were compact but functional, dominated by navigation charts, and a desk covered in weather reports and communication logs. The four of us crowded inside, James, Robert, Morrison, and myself. I asked Morrison to close the door and ensure we had privacy. He did so, his weathered face showing concern but also patience. He'd been running research vessels for over 20 years, and had learned to trust his scientists when they said something was urgent. I didn't ease into it. I told him we'd encountered an unknown species during our dive, something that appeared to be highly intelligent and capable of using tools. I said we had footage that would need to be reviewed immediately, and that I believed we needed to contact the Institute's director before proceeding with any additional dives. Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from concern to skepticism to something I couldn't quite read. When I finished, he asked the question I'd been dreading. What exactly did we see? Robert pulled out his laptop and loaded the footage while I tried to explain. I described the creatures' morphology, their behavior, the fact that they'd been carving symbols onto rock. I could hear how it sounded, how implausible and frankly insane it must have seemed. But then Robert turned the laptop around and played the clearest segment of footage, the section where the first creature had looked directly at our camera. Morrison watched in silence. He replayed it twice, leaning closer to the screen, and I saw his hands grip the edge of his desk. The captain asked if this could be some kind of equipment malfunction, a glitch in our cameras, or a reflection that we'd misinterpreted. James walked him through our system diagnostics, showing him the logs that proved all equipment had been functioning normally, the multiple camera angles that had captured the same images, the acoustic recordings of the vocalizations. This wasn't a technical error, this was real footage of something real that we'd encountered at depth. Morrison sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his radio and called his first officer, asking him to come to the quarters immediately. When the first officer arrived, Morrison had Robert show him the footage as well. The first officer's reaction was similar to Morrison's, initial disbelief giving way to a kind of stunned acceptance as he watched the creature move across the screen. Morrison told him to secure the Nereus 3 and to inform the crew that all dive operations were suspended until further notice. No one was to approach the submersible or access any of its systems without direct authorization. The first officer left to carry out those orders, and Morrison turned back to me. He said we needed to contact the Institute immediately, that this was beyond his authority to handle. I agreed, but I also told him about the backup drives Robert and I were carrying, that we'd made copies of the footage independently of the Nereus 3's main storage. Morrison looked at the equipment bags we'd brought with us, understanding the implication. I told him I wanted those drives to remain in our personal possession, that they represented our only guarantee that the evidence wouldn't disappear if something went wrong with the official channels. Morrison didn't argue. He simply nodded and said he'd make the call to San Diego within the hour. The rest of that day felt surreal. We were confined to the Atlantica, while Morrison dealt with the administrative chain, making secure calls back to the Institute and waiting for instructions. Robert spent hours reviewing the footage frame by frame, trying to capture the clearest possible images of the symbols carved into the rock. James compiled all our technical data into a comprehensive report. I tried to prepare a preliminary analysis of what we'd observed, but I kept stopping and starting because I didn't know how to categorize what we'd seen. This wasn't marine biology as I understood it. This was something else entirely. Morrison came to find me around 7 p.m. He said he'd spoken with Director Pembroke at the Institute, and that Pembroke had been initially skeptical but had become convinced once Morrison described the footage. Pembroke had contacted someone at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and NOAA had apparently escalated the report further up their chain of command. Morrison said we should expect additional instructions within the next 12 to 24 hours, possibly including orders to remain on site or to return to Guam immediately. Everything depended on how the various agencies decided to handle the discovery. I asked Morrison if he thought we'd made a mistake by reporting this. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said that secrets this big never stayed secret, that even if we'd tried to hide what we found, eventually someone would have discovered it. Better to be transparent and hope the authorities handled it responsibly than to risk being accused of a cover-up later. I wanted to believe he was right, but I also remembered the backup drives in my cabin, and I was glad we'd made copies. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, seeing those large black eyes looking at our camera, watching the creature carve symbols into stone with the care of someone recording something important. I thought about what those symbols might mean, whether they were language or mathematics or something else entirely. I wondered if the creatures lived in that cave system permanently, or if they'd just been passing through. I wondered how many of them there were and how long they'd been down there, invisible to us in the depths we'd only recently developed the technology to explore. The next morning, October 18th, Morrison received new orders. We were to secure all equipment and footage, prepare for an official visit from a specialized team that would arrive in Guam within 48 hours, and suspend all dive operations indefinitely. The orders came from NOAA but had been co-signed by someone at the Department of Defense, which struck me as unusual. Marine biology discoveries didn't typically involve the military unless there were national security implications. I mentioned this to James, and he agreed it was concerning, but said we should wait to see what the specialized team wanted before jumping to conclusions. We spent October 18th and 19th in a strange holding pattern. The Atlantica remained on station above the dive site, but we weren't permitted to conduct any additional surveys. The crew was told only that we'd encountered an unusual species that required further investigation by experts. Robert, James, and I were asked not to discuss the details with anyone else on board, though I suspected rumors were already spreading. In an environment as close quarters as a research vessel, secrets were nearly impossible to keep. On the evening of October 19th, Morrison received word that we were to return to Guam immediately, that the specialized team would meet us there rather than coming out to the dive site. We lifted anchor and began the 3-day journey back. I spent most of that time in my cabin, reviewing the footage and my notes, trying to prepare for whatever questions the experts would ask. The backup drive with our copied files stayed in my personal bag, wrapped in a waterproof case. I didn't mention it to anyone except James and Robert, and I'd made them promise not to discuss it over any radio or electronic communication that might be monitored. We arrived in Guam on the morning of October 22nd. As the Atlantica approached the harbor, I could see several vehicles parked on the dock that didn't belong to the Institute or any research organization I recognized. Dark SUVs with government plates, and several men in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of military or law enforcement. Morrison saw them too, and I watched his expression tighten. He told me to stay calm, to answer any questions honestly, and to remember that we hadn't done anything wrong. The moment we docked, before the crew had even finished securing the lines, 6 men came aboard. They showed identification that said they were with NOAA and the Department of Defense. They were polite but firm. They needed to speak with myself, James, and Robert immediately, and they needed access to the Nereus III and all associated equipment. Morrison tried to assert his authority as captain, asking to see their authorization and questioning their jurisdiction. They produced paperwork that looked official enough, signed by people whose names meant nothing to me but apparently satisfied Morrison's concerns. We were taken to a facility about 20 minutes from the harbor, a nondescript building that looked like it might house administrative offices. Inside, we were separated. I was led to a small conference room where two men were waiting. They introduced themselves as Dr. Raymond Foster from NOAA and Commander William Graves from Naval Intelligence. They asked me to describe the dive in detail, which I did, sticking to the observable facts. They wanted to know about the creature's behavior, their physical characteristics, the vocalizations we'd recorded. They asked specifically about the symbols on the rock wall. I told them everything I could remember, and they took notes on tablets without showing much reaction. Then Commander Graves asked about the footage, where it was stored, how many copies existed. I explained the Nereus 3's standard recording system and mentioned that we'd made backup copies to our portable drives as a precaution. Graves asked where those drives were. I told him they were in my personal effects on the Atlantica. He made a note and said they'd need to collect those drives, along with all other recording equipment. The interview lasted approximately 2 hours. When it was finished, they thanked me for my cooperation and said I was free to return to the Atlantica, but should remain available for additional questions. I was escorted back to the harbor by one of the men in civilian clothes. When I got back on board, James and Robert were already there, both of them looking shaken. The Nereus III was being loaded onto a flatbed truck, and several people in unmarked uniforms were carrying equipment crates off the vessel. Kind of debriefing conversation we'd normally have after a significant expedition. When we landed, we went our separate ways with awkward goodbyes, knowing that our careers had been fundamentally altered, but unable to discuss how or what it meant. I took a taxi to my apartment, a small one-bedroom place near the university where I'd lived for the past 8 years, and spent the evening sitting on my couch with the backup drive in my hands, trying to decide what to do with it. The rational choice was to destroy it, to eliminate any evidence that might contradict the official narrative or put me at risk of violating the NDA, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The footage represented proof of something extraordinary, and the scientist in me couldn't accept that such proof should be erased. I made a decision that night that I've questioned many times since. I would keep the drive, hidden and secure, but I wouldn't share it or use it unless circumstances made it absolutely necessary. It would be insurance, a guarantee that at least one record of the truth existed outside government control. I returned to work at the Institute on October 29th. Director Pembroke called me into his office within an hour of my arrival. He said he'd been briefed by federal authorities about the expedition's classification and that he understood I couldn't discuss what had happened. He asked if I was all right, if I needed any time off or support services. I told him I was fine and ready to resume my regular duties. Pembroke studied me for a moment, and I had the sense he wanted to ask more but knew he couldn't. He told me there would be no official report filed about the dive, that the expedition would be recorded in Institute records as having been cut short due to equipment issues. My next assignment would be a coastal survey project starting in 3 weeks, something safe and thoroughly mundane. Over the following months, I tried to settle back into normal life. I worked on the coastal survey, published a paper on bioluminescent bacteria that I'd been drafting before the Guam expedition, attended faculty meetings and research seminars. On the surface, everything appeared normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about the creatures and the symbols on the cave wall. I found myself going to the university library during lunch breaks, pulling books on ancient writing systems and symbolic communication. I told myself I was just curious, just following an intellectual thread, but the truth was I was obsessed with understanding what we'd seen. In January 2010, I ran into Robert at a marine biology conference in Seattle. We had coffee in the hotel lobby, carefully avoiding any mention of the previous October until we were sure we weren't being overheard. Robert told me he'd been having nightmares about the creatures, dreams where they were trying to communicate something urgent but he couldn't understand them. He asked if I ever wondered what the symbols meant, and I admitted I thought about it constantly. We talked in careful euphemisms about whether it would be possible to research ancient symbolic languages without drawing attention, whether there might be academics we could consult who wouldn't ask too many questions about our interest. James, I learned, had left the Institute entirely. Robert said he'd taken a position with a private sector company doing underwater construction surveys, work that kept him in shallower water and away from anything resembling research. I couldn't blame him. The encounter had changed. Morrison found me on deck and told me quietly that they'd confiscated everything. All the recording equipment, all the data drives from the Nereus III's main storage, even our personal laptops that had been used to review footage. They'd gone through our cabins with our permission, which wasn't really permission since refusing would have created more problems and taken anything that might contain files related to the dive. Morrison said they'd been thorough but professional, and that we'd been given receipts for everything they'd removed. I went to my cabin and confirmed what I already knew. The backup drive I'd hidden in my waterproof case, wrapped inside a spare diving suit in the bottom of my storage locker, was still there. They'd searched the cabin but hadn't found it. Or perhaps they'd assumed they'd already collected all the drives when they took the ones from our equipment bags. Either way, I still had a complete copy of the 42 minutes of footage, and I wasn't going to tell anyone unless I absolutely had to. That evening, Commander Graves came back to the Atlantica with paperwork for all three of us to sign. Non-disclosure agreements that classified everything we'd observed during the dive as related to national security. The documents said we were prohibited from discussing the encounter with anyone, from publishing any findings, from sharing any information about the creatures or their location. Violation of the agreement could result in criminal prosecution. We signed because we didn't have any real choice, and because refusing would have only made things worse. Before Graves left, he told us that the site would be monitored and that future research in that area would require special clearance. He thanked us for our service to our country, which felt absurd given that we'd just been scientists doing our jobs. Then he was gone, and we were left sitting on the Atlantica, with almost nothing to show for one of the most significant discoveries in human history. Almost nothing, except for the drive in my cabin that no one knew existed. We remained in Guam for 3 more days while the authorities completed their confiscation and documentation process. During that time, James, Robert, and I were effectively quarantined on the Atlantica, permitted to leave the vessel only under escort, and forbidden from communicating with anyone back at the Institute except through official channels. Morrison did what he could to keep our spirits up, but the atmosphere on board had shifted from the usual camaraderie of a research mission to something closer to a military detention. The crew knew something significant had happened, and our forced isolation only fed the speculation. On October 25th, we were finally cleared to leave Guam. Morrison received orders to return the Atlantica to San Diego, and the 3 of us were booked on commercial flights home. Before we left, Commander Graves met with us one final time in a hotel conference room near the harbor. He emphasized again the importance of the non-disclosure agreements we'd signed, and he added details that hadn't been in the written documents. We were not to discuss the encounter with family members, friends, or colleagues. If anyone asked about our expedition, we were to say it had been routine, that we'd collected standard data and returned as scheduled. If we were approached by media or anyone expressing unusual interest in our work, we were to report it immediately to a phone number Graves provided. James asked what would happen to the footage and data they'd confiscated. Graves said it was being analyzed by appropriate specialists and that the findings would inform future policy decisions about deep-sea research in sensitive areas. When James pressed for more specifics, asking if we'd ever see the results of that analysis, Graves's expression hardened slightly. He said that information was classified and that our role in the discovery was complete. We should consider ourselves fortunate to have witnessed something remarkable and leave the complicated questions to people with broader security clearances. Robert asked about the creatures themselves, whether there were plans to study them further or to try to establish communication. Graves paused before answering, and I noticed he chose his words carefully. He said that any future research would be conducted by teams with appropriate expertise and security protocols. When Robert suggested that we were the appropriate experts, that we were the marine biologists who'd actually encountered the species, Graves cut him off. He said the matter was no longer under civilian scientific jurisdiction and that we should focus on our regular work and forget about what we'd seen. That statement more than anything else convinced me that whatever these creatures were, the government's interest went far beyond academic curiosity. The way Graves spoke suggested they already knew something about what we'd found, or at least suspected enough to want complete control over any information. I thought about the symbols carved into the rock wall and wondered if those symbols were the reason for all the secrecy. Intelligence, tool use, those were remarkable enough. But written language suggested something more. A level of cognitive sophistication that raised uncomfortable questions about consciousness, rights, and what we owed to species we'd only just discovered. We flew back to San Diego on October 26th. I sat between James and Robert on the plane, and we barely spoke. The non-disclosure agreements weighed on all of us, creating a barrier to the decision to begin investigating historical patterns wasn't something I made consciously. It started in January 2023 when I was conducting routine research for a paper on deep-sea biodiversity and stumbled across a reference in an old maritime journal from 1876. The journal was digitized in a university archive, and I was looking for historical data on fish populations when I found a brief entry by a British naval officer describing an unusual encounter during a survey expedition off the coast of Japan. The officer wrote about finding symbols carved into rocks in a coastal cave that had been exposed by an unusually low tide. He'd made sketches of the symbols, noting they resembled no known Japanese writing, and he'd mentioned that local villagers avoided the cave because they believed it was inhabited by sea demons who warn of the Great Drowning. That phrase, Great Drowning, caught my attention immediately. I'd been carrying Dr. Whitmore's translation of the Cyprus carvings with me for over a year, memorizing the warning about waters rising and lands sinking. The naval officer's description from 1876 suggested similar beliefs had existed in multiple locations, and that these beliefs were associated with specific symbols in underwater or coastal caves. I spent the rest of that day searching through the archive for any other references to unusual maritime discoveries, and by evening I'd found 3 more accounts from different time periods and locations, all describing carved symbols in caves and local legends about warnings from the sea. Over the following months, I developed a systematic research method. I would spend my evenings and weekends searching through digitized archives of maritime journals, archaeological reports, anthropological studies, and historical texts, looking for any mention of symbols, carvings, caves, and sea creatures. I created a database to track my findings, noting locations, dates, descriptions of symbols, and any associated folklore or local beliefs. I was careful to conduct all this research on computers not connected to my institute accounts, using library systems and internet cafes, paying for archive access with prepaid cards purchased with cash. The pattern that emerged was extraordinary. I found references spanning nearly every coastal region of the world, and dating back as far as written records existed. Ancient Greek texts mentioned symbols found in flooded caves near Santorini, described by priests as warnings from Poseidon about future floods. Medieval Islamic scholars in Morocco had documented symbols in coastal caves that local Berber populations said were left by jinn who lived beneath the waves. Chinese maritime records from the Ming dynasty mentioned symbols discovered in caves along the southern coast that resembled no known writing system and were associated with legends about dragon people who had retreated to the ocean depths after a great flood. What struck me was the consistency of the associated beliefs. Across different cultures and time periods, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history, the symbols were connected to stories about flooding, about beings who lived in the ocean, and about warnings. The specific details varied, shaped by each culture's mythology and cosmology, but the core elements remained constant. Something in the deep ocean was trying to communicate with humanity about water and catastrophe, and had been trying for a very long time. I found a particularly detailed account in the journals of a Spanish conquistador who'd explored the coast of Peru in 1531. He documented symbols in a cave system that local indigenous people said was sacred, a place where messages from the old ones who swim could sometimes be found. The conquistador had made careful drawings of the symbols, and his journal had been preserved in a monastery archive in Seville. I was able to access high-resolution scans of the journal pages, and when I compared his drawings to the symbols from my 2009 footage and the Cyprus photographs, I found matches, at least 6 symbols. The captain wrote that during a storm, his ship had taken shelter in a cove where they'd discovered a cave partially submerged by the tide. Several crew members had explored the cave and found symbols carved into the walls. But more significantly, they'd encountered something living in the cave's depths, something the captain described as neither fish nor man, but bearing aspects of both. The creature had not attacked them, but had made sounds and gestures that the captain interpreted as attempts to communicate. One of the crew members, who spoke several languages, had thought the creature was trying to warn them about something related to water and darkness. The captain's letter to the bishop asked for guidance on whether these beings were demons that should be destroyed, animals that could be captured, or possibly souls in need of salvation. The bishop's response, also preserved in the archive, was chilling in its pragmatism. The bishop wrote that such beings were likely offspring of fallen angels and humans, that they should be avoided as dangerous, and that any knowledge of them should be kept secret to prevent panic among the faithful. He specifically instructed the captain to tell no one else about the encounter and to avoid that region of coast in future voyages. This was evidence of institutional suppression dating back nearly 700 years. The pattern wasn't new. Authorities, whether religious or governmental, had been actively concealing information about these creatures for centuries. The reasons might have changed over time, from religious concerns about demon-human hybrids to modern national security justifications, but the result was the same: a sustained effort to prevent humanity from learning about these beings and taking their warnings seriously. I spent the remainder of 2023 and into early 2024 continuing my research, finding more fragments of the pattern scattered through historical records. Each discovery reinforced my conviction that the creature's warning was real and that the suppression of that warning was systematic and long-standing, but I still didn't know what to do with this knowledge. Publishing it would almost certainly result in my arrest for violating the NDA, and without the credibility of mainstream scientific journals, my findings would likely be dismissed as conspiracy theory or fringe archaeology. The decision about whether to go public was taken out of my hands in March 2024, when events in the Pacific Ocean suddenly made the creatures and their warnings impossible to ignore. On March 8, 2024, I received a phone call from Robert. We hadn't spoken in nearly 10 years, not since he'd helped me enhance the footage back in 2014. His voice was tense when I answered, and he asked if I was somewhere private where we could talk safely. I went out to my car and drove to an empty parking lot before calling him back. Robert told me he'd been contacted 2 days earlier by a former colleague from his time working with the Deep Sea Research Institute, someone who'd moved on to a position with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The colleague had reached out informally, carefully avoiding any official channels, to tell Robert that something significant had happened in the Western Pacific. On March 15, 2024, the decision became urgent. News broke that a Navy drilling operation near the Mariana Trench had been suddenly halted with no public explanation. The official statement said only that operations had been suspended due to technical concerns requiring further review, but maritime industry sources reported that all personnel had been evacuated from the drilling platform within 6 hours, and that a Navy destroyer had been positioned nearby, apparently maintaining some kind of security perimeter. I saw the news on my office computer at the Institute, and I immediately knew what had happened. The drilling had gotten too close to wherever the creatures were living, and they'd responded in some way that had forced the Navy to shut everything down. Maybe they'd been more aggressive than they'd been with us in 2009. Maybe they'd damaged equipment, or maybe the Navy had simply detected so many of them in the area that they'd realized they were dealing with a substantial population rather than a few isolated individuals. That evening, I made copies of everything I had. The backup drive with the 2009 footage, all of Dr. Whitmore's translation notes, my database of historical discoveries, the photographs from Cyprus, every piece of evidence I'd accumulated over 15 years. I made 3 complete sets, storing them in different secure locations. Then I contacted the journalist Robert had recommended, using an encrypted email service and a temporary account I'd set up specifically for this purpose. I told her I had evidence of a non-human intelligent species living in the deep ocean, evidence that had been suppressed by federal authorities, and warnings from that species about catastrophic climate change. I said I was willing to provide everything, including footage and translated messages, if she could guarantee source protection and publication in a venue that would be taken seriously. The journalist's name was Sarah Kensington, and she worked for a major investigative news organization with a track record of handling classified information responsibly. She responded within 12 hours, saying she was interested but that she'd need to verify the credibility of my evidence before committing to publication. We arranged to meet in person in late March at a location she chose, a coffee shop in Berkeley where she said she'd conducted other sensitive meetings. I brought one complete set of the evidence with me, hours of footage, hundreds of pages of documentation, and the translation of the warning that had been left in caves around the world. Sarah spent 3 days reviewing everything I'd provided. She consulted with marine biologists to verify that the footage hadn't been manipulated or staged. She contacted experts in ancient languages to assess Dr. Whitmore's translation work. She reached out to sources within NOAA and the Navy to confirm that something unusual had happened in the Western Pacific in March 2024. By the end of her investigation, She told me she believed the evidence was credible and that the story needed to be published. But she also warned me that I'd be facing serious legal consequences for violating my non-disclosure agreement, that I should prepare for potential arrest and prosecution. I told her I understood the risks and that I was ready to accept them, because the alternative, staying silent while the warnings went unheeded and the waters continued to rise, felt more dangerous than any legal consequences I might face. The creatures had been trying for centuries, possibly millennia, to communicate something crucial to humanity. They'd left messages in caves. They'd attempted contact with sailors and fishermen. They'd carved warnings in multiple languages and scripts, hoping that someone would eventually understand and take them seriously. And every time, authorities had suppressed the information, erased the evidence, silenced the witnesses. But now the creatures were becoming more active, making themselves detectable in ways they hadn't before. The acoustic signals in the Mariana Trench, the response to the drilling operation, these suggested increasing urgency. Climate science supported that urgency. Sea levels were rising faster than earlier projections had predicted. Coastal cities were already dealing with increased flooding. The catastrophic future the creatures had warned about wasn't some distant possibility, it was beginning to happen in our lifetimes. Sarah's article was published on April 30, 2024. It included selected footage from the 2009 encounter, images of the symbols from multiple locations, Dr. Whitmore's translation of the warning, and my account of 15 years of investigation and suppression. The response was immediate and divided. Some readers dismissed it as elaborate hoax or misidentified known species. Others, particularly in the scientific community, called for immediate investigation and independent verification. Climate scientists noted that the warning about rising waters aligned with their own projections and that the creature's suggested solution, adaptation to underwater life, might need to be taken seriously as a worst-case scenario preparation. The federal response was also immediate. On May 2, 2024, I was arrested at my home on charges of violating national security protocols by disclosing classified information. My attorney argued that I'd been operating as a whistleblower, revealing information of vital public importance, but the prosecution maintained that I'd signed legal agreements fully aware of the consequences and that my disclosure had potentially compromised ongoing national security operations. The legal battle continued for months, and I'm still dealing with the consequences as I record this account. But something else happened that mattered more than my personal legal situation. Within weeks of Sarah's article being published, researchers around the world began reporting their own encounters with the symbols or the creatures. A team working in the Mediterranean found carvings in an underwater cave off the coast of Malta. A Japanese oceanographic institute released footage they'd captured years earlier but had kept classified, showing what appeared to be the same species we'd encountered in 2009. Archaeological teams started examining caves in coastal regions with new understanding of what to look for, and they found symbols that matched the patterns Dr. Whitmore had documented. The suppression was breaking down. Too many people in too many locations were discovering the same evidence, and authorities couldn't confiscate or classify all of it quickly enough. The pattern was becoming undeniable, and public pressure was building for honest investigation rather than continued secrecy. Some governments, particularly in Pacific Island nations, already dealing with severe flooding, began calling for international cooperation to establish communication with the creatures and learn whatever they might be willing to teach about surviving in a flooded world. I'm speaking now, 3 months after the article's publication, and still facing potential prison time for what I've disclosed, because I believe we're at a crucial moment. The creatures have been patient for centuries, leaving warnings and hoping we'd understand before it was too late. But their patience appears to be running out, and the urgency they're displaying suggests we have less time than we think. The acoustic signals in the Mariana Trench, the increased activity near drilling sites, these might be final attempts to get our attention before they give up on communicating with us entirely. The warning is clear. Major sea level rise is coming, potentially catastrophic enough to displace billions of people and submerge most coastal civilization. When that happens, humanity will face a choice between extinction and adaptation. The creatures survived that same choice thousands of years ago. and they develop the biological or technological means to live at depth permanently. They're offering to help us make the same transition if we're willing to listen and learn. I don't know if we'll take that offer seriously. I don't know if we'll overcome our fear and prejudice long enough to establish genuine communication with a non-human intelligence. But I know that staying silent was no longer an option, that the risks of disclosure were outweighed by the necessity of making the warning public while there's still time to prepare. Whatever consequences I face for breaking my silence, they're worth it if it means even one more person takes the creature's message seriously and starts thinking about what adaptation might require. The depth keeps us. The depth kept them. When the water rises, the depth will keep you. That warning carved in caves around the world isn't mythology or primitive superstition. It's practical advice from survivors of a previous catastrophe, advice we ignore at our own peril. I'm 58 years old, and I've spent 16 years carrying this secret. Now it's not my secret anymore. It's humanity's challenge to meet, and we're running out of time to decide whether we'll face it with wisdom or denial.